All right, good evening or good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the African Tea Time event today. My name is Damaris Choti, and I'm coordinator of student and alumni programs with the African Studies Center here at Michigan State University. I wish to welcome you all to today's discussion on Africa-China relations, and indeed, it's my pleasure to welcome you all, as I said in the beginning, and to also welcome our presenters who will be leading the discussion today. We're very, very excited to have you be here today, spare your time to lead us in this discussion. It's a very important subject. I think most of you will agree with me that it's Africa issues to do with relations between China and its presence in the African continent has led to different debates across the regions within Africa itself. So I feel like we're privileged to have our two presenters who are knowledgeable in this field that are going to respond to our questions that we may have and also just give us what's current in regard to this debate or this discussion. So what we are going to do, we have two presenters, and our first presenter is Dr. Carolyn Logan, and Dr. Logan is a professor here at Michigan State University in the Department of Political Science, and she's also Director of Analysis with Afrobarometer, Michigan State University as well. And she will be presenting first, and the topic of her talk today is African Citizens' Perspectives on China-Africa Relations, Welcoming China's Influence While Maintaining Commitment to Democracy. When her time comes, Dr. Logan will introduce herself more. And then our second speaker is Arhin Acheampong. Arhin is currently Deputy Director at Afro-Sino Center for International Relations, ASCIR, which is based in Ghana. And I want to mention also that Arhin is an alum of MSU. So he will be our second presenter, and he is going to speak on making a case for African urgency in Afro-Sino relations. That's his topic of presentation today. So as I mentioned, our first presenter will be Dr. Logan. And at this point, I want to welcome her to begin the discussion. Thank you so much again for joining us. Dr.
Great,
Logan.
thank you so much, Damaris, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see, sorry, slide. All right, there, and you know, we're a small group, so I'm happy to be, you know, people can obviously save questions for the end, but I'm also happy if you jump in with questions. I won't really be able to see if people have questions, I think, so just feel free to kind of turn on your mic and jump in and interrupt if there's something to say. Otherwise we can save questions for the end. So yeah, I'm in the political science department, and I am also with the Afrobarometer. I'm director of analysis for Afrobarometer. For those of you who don't know, MSU is one of the founding institutions of Afrobarometer, and I'm going to say a little bit more about what we do. I hope. I never know when I've got an audience who already knows a lot about it or who doesn't know anything about it. So I'll give you a little background. I hope I don't do too much reviewing of things people already know. But MSU is one of Mike Bratton, who's now retired emeritus, was one of the 3 co-founders of Afrobarometer 23 years ago, back in 1999. And MSU was kind of the lead institution in the network for the first 3 rounds of surveys. We received most of the grants and did the sub-granting to African partners and things. But we've moved increasingly over the years, more and more of the functions MSU was handling over to African partners. The Center for Democratic Development took over in 2008 as the lead institution. And then about, I think is it 3 years ago now, Afrobarometer actually finally registered as an independent institution with its secretariat based in Accra. But MSU still is a support unit to the network, and we have a team of graduate students that are working on the project in various ways. So let me give a little more background, and then I'll get into some of our China-specific findings. I'll go through this part pretty quickly. So for those of you who might not know us, we are a Pan-African, nonpartisan survey research network. We do public attitude surveys that get feedback on people's attitudes, experiences, evaluations, their political participation, all kinds of issues. Our core topics are democracy and governance, but that's kind of governance writ large. So, I mean, governance touches on a lot of areas, health and education and all kinds of things. So you'll see in a few minutes, we cover a really wide range of topics. We've been getting a bit more into sort of beyond the borders topics. I mean, for a long time, we focused mostly on, you know, domestic issues, but we've been looking a bit more at global and international issues. So that's the source of this data we've got today on China. We've completed 8 rounds of surveys. We do our surveys in rounds. So we do all the countries in the space of about usually 18 months to 2 years. We completed round 8 surveys in October. We got stopped halfway through round 8 by COVID. We had to stop all our field work because our surveys are face-to-face, but we were able in late 2020 to go back in the field and complete round 8 in October. We are now in the field with round 9 surveys, and those should be completed by later this year, we hope, in up to 40 countries. We keep trying to expand. Our fundamental goal, the whole reason the project exists, is fundamentally to give the public a voice in policymaking. The project started when there was a lot of democratic opening, political opening on the continent, a lot of shift toward multi-party elections, and the feeling was that if you're going to have multi-party democracy, you know, we need to know what the people think and what they want and be able to speak to the public. We've increasingly, as we've expanded, moved into more and more authoritarian countries as well, and continue to find that actually in most countries, not all countries, but in most countries, that's a viable option to still do public opinion surveys, even where there is not a very robust multi-party democracy. Our objectives, we've always had since the beginning sort of 3 core objectives. The first being to collect high quality data on public attitudes, but alongside that, we've had a very deep core commitment to capacity building on the continent. I think our partners are now in many cases considered kind of some of the go-to partners for this kind of high quality survey research on the continent. We've also do lots and lots of capacity building on analysis and on communications and public outreach. And then we've also had a very core commitment to getting the findings into the public domain. The project, you know, our data is all, we try and make everything a public good. So our data is all on the website. We publish things, we have Twitter feeds and all kinds of things trying to get, we want the data used in the public domain. So we are doing analysis at levels from sort of more academic levels, working papers and journal articles and books, but also tons of press releases and basic dispatches and infographics and other kinds of things, trying to get the data into as many hands as possible. Methodology, you know, I say this is something we're really proud of. We have a survey manual that's also a public good on the website that is widely used by other people doing survey research in Africa. It's been this, Afrobarometer's work has been described as the gold standard for survey research in Africa on more than one occasion, we're happy to say. We do nationally representative samples, and all in total across the 34 or 35 countries that we've been doing in the last couple of rounds represent about 75 or 80% of the population of the continent. The nationally representative bit means we respondents are selected randomly and the sample is distributed around the country with probability proportionate to population size, so that people in more populous areas, that if you know, 10% of the population of a country is in a certain region, that we do 10% of our sample in that region. We distribute the sample in proportion to the population. Means every adult has an equal chance of being included. Another really important part of our methodology is that we translate it in most countries into quite a few local languages, and people can be interviewed in the language of their choice. We use a standard questionnaire in each round so that we can make comparisons across countries. In addition, and you'll see a little bit of this here, we also try have a lot of questions that we keep over time. So about 60% of the questionnaire stays the same from one round to the next, so that we can track opinions over time. And then the other 40% is special modules on current topics, which is where this China data comes from. And our sample sizes are between 12 and 2,400 adults, and that leaves a margin of error plus or minus 2 to 3%. This is our total country coverage, all the countries we've ever been to. In round 8 that we completed in October, we went to 34 countries. You can see there's big gaps through the middle that we're trying to fill, but there's conditions about having a good census frame, having enough political openness, and having enough security to be able to go to any given country. So that's kept us out of a few places. We're just about to go into Mauritania, which will fill that big hole in West Africa, as well as we just advertised today for a partner in Guinea-Bissau, and hoping to go to a couple other new places. And then just so you can see quickly, as I mentioned, democracy and governance are our core topics. We cover a ton of stuff. The topics on the top are things that we cover consistently in every round. The ones down below are things we've covered in kind of special, sometimes one-off or sometimes just occasional modules. And in round 9, we've got questions on gender equality, gender-based violence, COVID, of course, and a host of other issues. And that's also included globalism in China. We did a special module that's from round 8 on China. And just quickly, we'll brag for a minute. We've done more than 220 surveys, 330,000 interviews, publishing hundreds of publications a year, lots of media coverage, lots of website hits. So continuing to grow and build the project into sort of having an important influence on policy across the continent and globally. A lot of policy towards Africa uses Afrobarometer data. So the China module, so we had some questions originally on China in round 6, and then we've also had, which was that was 2014, 2015, and then we had a special module in round 8 that just finished. So that's the 2019 to 2021 data. So in some cases, I'm just going to show you the latest round 8 data, but in some cases, I've got comparisons over time. And I'll just get right into some of the findings on that. One of the questions we've asked people, and that we've asked this in both times that we did the China module, was what, in their opinion, what country, if any, would be the best model for the future development of their own country. You can see in this that the United States is still the most preferred model at 33%, but China is second at 22%. That gap has closed just a point or two since the first time we asked this question in round 6. I think it's pretty interesting that the next on the continent is actually the next country, South Africa, is actually, of course, on the continent. And if you add in the proportion down at the bottom, the 7% who say their own country should be the best model, I think that, the fact that we're seeing more people focusing on African models is quite interesting, about 20% focusing on the continent. Former colonial powers much lower, and a few other odds and ends there. But when you look at how preference for the China or US model across countries, so you see quite a wide variation. You can see over on the left-hand side, Liberia, the purple bars are the preference for the US model and the red for the China model. High preference for the US model in Liberia compared to all other countries, and also Sierra Leone, a number of others, even Morocco in North Africa, which I think is an interesting finding. But then you can see over on the other side of the chart, several countries, Benin, Burkina Faso, and Mali in particular, where the China model is much more strongly preferred. Eswatini that doesn't care for either, so there's quite a wide cross-country variation, and this tends to be the pattern on most of our questions, that it's useful to look at country averages, but you also usually have to drill down and look at what's happening in a particular country to get the full sense of what's going on. One thing that I think is notable here in terms of the preference for the China model is that also, people, this is definitely a set of attitudes that's in flux. Sometimes when we ask questions, we don't see a lot of change over time. Here, you can see in the middle, the 31 country average, that there's not a lot of change between round 8 and round 6 the average level of preference for the China model. But if you look at individual countries, there's quite large changes. So for example, Cameroon had quite high preference for the China model in round 6, but that's really dropped off from 48 to 23%. Benin, on the other hand, up at the top, and Burkina Faso, China really is making inroads in terms of its impression there. You know, and we haven't sort of done the level of analysis here. We have so much data, we don't get the chance to do all the different analysis we want. I think one of the things we'd like to see happen is to map some of this data onto other data sources about investment and the kinds of investment and infrastructure projects that are going on in any given country over time, so that we can kind of look at some of the reasons why these change so much over time. But those would be some of the places I would look for those kinds of changes. And that just shows you the change in preference for China is the best model, same as what I mentioned, Benin and Burkina Faso with the largest increases, along with Uganda, Cameroon, Eswatini, Liberia, Tunisia, all declining preference for the China model. So again, lots of interesting questions to be looked at in terms of what might explain that. Very quickly here, I think one of the things that sometimes we see quite large differences across different demographic groups in attitudes. I think in this case, we see quite a lot of consistency. You look at, you know, men and women, urban and rural areas, very small within the margin of error, generally differences between the attitudes of those groups. A little bit more preference for China, for the US model among younger populations. I think that's the most significant difference we see, and some higher preference for the US, well, slightly higher preference for the US model among the more educated populations. One other indicator we have about models, and this is a much different kind of question that kind of gives another angle on looking at this, is that we asked people what they thought was the most important international language for their children to learn in the country, for young people to learn in the country. French and English still, English of course very dominant here, and French not far behind. Chinese still following far behind. This again in the context of recognizing that there's been some efforts by the Chinese government to push language education in some parts of the continent in urban areas, but still sort of low priority on learning Chinese on the continent, generally speaking. Another set of questions we asked was about external influence more broadly. And we asked this question, as you can see, about several different countries, China, US, whatever the regional superpower is in the region that we asked about, meaning South Africa and Southern Africa, Nigeria and West Africa, Kenya and East Africa. We also asked about Russia, and then some of the UN regional alliances, African Union. And what we asked people was whether the influence of this country or organization was mostly in their country, was mostly positive, mostly negative, or whether they hadn't heard enough to say. And the green bars are those who said it's somewhat or very positive. The red are those who say it's somewhat or very negative. And the yellow in the middle is those who either refused or don't know. So you can see there's still quite a high level of non-opinion, although that's definitely going down over time. When we look at places like the UN agencies and the African Union, we used to see quite a bit higher levels of don't know when we've asked similar questions 10 years ago. The key point here, China actually has the most positive impression. You can see 63%, although the United States at 60% is that's just outside the margin of error, so slightly below, but not a lot. Russia is one of the countries that's been sort of becoming more engaged on the continent, so which is why we just added that this time around. You can see that Russia's one where actually the don't knows are still by far the largest category of response. And of course, this was all done before recent developments in that part of the world. So how Russia would look after that it will be an interesting question in the next round. But one of the really important things, so you can see China and the US quite similar. And one of the things I think is a really important finding out of all of this is that this compares China and the US in terms of the percent in each country who said that they had a somewhat or very positive influence in their country. And what you can see here is that, you know, while a lot of the world, a lot of people in the US sort of think about this as an either or, a trade-off, a battle for influence, you know, between the US and China, it's really not seen that way on the ground. The two findings are very strongly correlated. If people have a more positive influence, more positive impression of China, they're more likely to have a positive view of the US as well, and vice versa. There's exceptions. You can see up at the top, Eswatini has a much more positive impression of the China than the US, and there's a few countries to some degree in the opposite category, but overall there's a strong correlation between the positive impressions. So it's more of a win-win than a win-lose kind of contest in the perspective of people on the ground, which I think is a pretty important finding. And we've also, but again, if you look at the country level, there has not, this is about the positive positive impressions of China's influence. You can see in the middle, the 30 country average has only changed by 2 points over time. So that's not outside the margin of error, but there's been still some significant changes across countries. Mali has a much less positive impression, and Niger, of China than they did in the last round, whereas Morocco and Malawi have much more positive views than they did last time around. We also asked a question about the extent of China's influence, how much influence China has on the country's economy. And this is showing the percent who said somewhat or a lot in 2019 in the round 8 surveys. So you can see the 34 country average in the middle there for the latest round is 59% saying that China has some or a lot of influence in their country, quite a high level, though it ranges quite widely from 80% in Morocco to just 21% in Sierra Leone, who think that the country has a lot of influence. But what I also want to point out is that this is one area where we do see some significant change. The lighter purple bars show the level of influence in the round 6 survey. And there's been a 12-point drop in the percent who say that China has some or a lot of influence in their country, which is a quite significant change over the time period we're looking at. We don't often see such large changes, and you can see that, and I'll show that here. You can see this just shows the change in each country, the 12-point drop here in the middle, and you can see that almost all of the countries where we have this tracked over time, the 30 countries where we have data from both rounds, all but 3 of those show, well, I'd say all but 6 of those show a significant decline, and just a couple of them show a significant gain. So Morocco, China has, people see China as having much more influence than it did just a few years ago, but almost everywhere else people are seeing the influence dropping somewhat, which I think is also something we would like to investigate further. We also asked, you know, one of the narratives in US, in Washington, and US political spheres has been about China trying to kind of raise concerns about the possibility that China's creating debt traps by giving a lot of easy, low condition loans to Africa that they are eventually going to come and collect on. So we asked a number of questions about the China loans. Can I just ask, when you guys see my screen, do you see this control bar? Is it blocking your view or not? I'm just not sure where to put that so that it's not, I don't know if you see that.
We can see your screen, Walker.
Okay, that's fine. So the first question we asked was whether people had even heard about the fact that China gives loans and development assistance to their country. The 33 country average on this was 47%. These questions weren't asked in Eswatini, compared to 27% who said they had not heard, and sorry, this one is confused. So yeah, so 47% who've heard of Chinese loans or development assistance in their country. And then of those people, so we only did the follow-on questions with those people who had heard that there were loans or development assistance. If people hadn't heard about it, we didn't carry on and ask the questions. Then we asked a number of follow-up questions, though, of that group. So we first asked, the yellow bars are a question about whether they believe that their governments are going to have to repay, whether China requires that those loans and development assistance to be repaid. About 75% understood that to be the case. And then we also asked people whether they thought China had borrowed too much money, their government had borrowed too much money from China. And that stands at 57% on average across these countries. So a majority of the people who've heard about loans and development assistance from China think that their governments have been borrowing too much. I'll just mention as an aside, I won't go into some of these other questions that didn't have anything to do with China specifically, so they aren't here, but we did ask a number of questions about people's overall perspective on loans and development assistance from anywhere. And there's definitely seems to be a fair amount of support across the continent for becoming more economically independent and reducing loans and development assistance, even if it means increasing taxes, which I think is an important caveat on that. So, and we can talk about that more in the discussion if people are interested. We also asked, because there's certainly the perception, the understanding out there that China's loans generally come with less conditionality, especially political conditionality, but also more generally. And we asked people whether they knew whether China had more or less or the same levels of conditions on their loans and development assistance compared to the loans and assistance from other parts of the world. The green bars are those who said that China puts somewhat or far fewer requirements, and you can see that's definitely the plurality view. So there is, even though many people didn't know, the yellow bars, the gray bars are those who said they don't know. So there's a fair amount of lack of knowledge on this question, but the plurality view is that China puts less requirements. The blue bars are those who think they actually put more requirements. So there's not consensus on this question, and I think you would need to take a country by country look to assess what the actual reality is on the ground. But I think it's interesting that the general understanding that there's less conditionality on China's loans has definitely come through to the public to some degree. These are a couple of questions that are more general, this and the next one, about overall attitudes towards conditionality. They're not asking about China specifically, they're just asking about whether people generally support conditionality on loans. And in this case, it's a question about whether they think governments whether external sources of loans and development assistance should be putting conditions on the recipient governments about how to use the resources. 55% say no, the yellow bars, compared to 42% who say yes. In most countries, a majority or at least a plurality say that there should not be conditions. There's a few countries that, especially Liberia and Sierra Leone down at the bottom, that seem to be looking towards more external enforcement of good spending behavior, but most people want their governments to be allowed more independence of action in terms of how resources are spent. The other one was the question of whether loans should be tied to respect for democracy and human rights, whether there should be conditionalities on democracy and human rights. In this case, 51% said the government should make its own decision. So still a slight majority in favor, although a slightly larger minority saying that they felt that those kinds of conditions were acceptable, 51% versus 46%. So a much more close divide. But again, as in all cases, you can see there's quite wide range across countries. So if we had the time to go through 34 countries, we could look at those in much more detail. Last thing, sorry, I think I'm taking more than my time. Last thing to say is that one of the key questions that comes up about all this is, does this mean if Africans are, if there's a lot of interest in the China model, if people are saying they support the China model, does that mean that they're not interested in democracy, since China clearly isn't promoting a democratic model? And that's one of the things we don't see at all. We see support for so this compares, so the red bars are people who said they preferred the China model, and the purple bars are those who say they preferred the US model. And you can see that across all these indicators of demand for democracy, as we call it, they're pretty even. Those who support the China model, prefer the China model, are just a point or two. It's not outside the margin of error. So there's no real difference. People, they don't see a contradiction between preferring China model and supporting democracy. And our read on this, for a variety of reasons, is that people really, when they look at the model of China, what they're seeing is much more about the economic model that China presents, not a political model. This again is data we cover elsewhere, but there's we have a lot of evidence that support for democracy, elections, democratic practices in a whole variety of areas remains high and very strong across Africa over time. So there's been a lot of concern about democratic decline on the continent, but the decline is on the supply side. The demand side is not where the decline is coming from. People want democracy that continues to be strong, and the rise of China isn't affecting that, as we can see here. It also doesn't have a very big influence on how people perceive their political systems and evaluate their political systems. People are somewhat less likely to perceive somewhat more likely to perceive their political system as showing democratic criteria if they support the China model, prefer the China model, but the differences are generally quite small. So I'll wrap it up there, just to say again, the US is still the more widely preferred model compared to China, although the NAP gap has narrowed a little. Both China and US are seen as positive influences to about the same rate. And again, that's really strongly correlated. So it's more of a win-win in terms of the positive versus negative attitudes towards the two countries. Many are believing that that their countries are borrowing too much from China, and the preference for the China model isn't linked to demand for democracy. And I will stop there. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Logan, for that very insightful presentation on the work that you are doing in different realms, including the China-Africa relations. So I know the audience might be having questions, but as I said on the chat, we will keep the questions until the end, if you can bear with me on that, so that at this time we can have Arhin give his talk, and then we can open it up for discussion. Please type your questions or just keep them somewhere in the back of your mind. Don't forget your question. And then the discussion is coming right after Arhin's talk. Please, Arhin, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Choti. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are across the globe. It is indeed such a pleasure and honor to share this platform with you, Dr. Choti, Professor Logan, and all our audience. As Dr. Choti said, my name is Arhin Acheampong. I'm the Deputy Director of the Afro-Sino Center of International Relations. At ASCIR, we do extensive research on Africa-China relations. Basically, our two key stakeholders are the African Union and the Chinese government, and in this case, Chinese embassies across all the 54, 55 African states, as well as we also do advocacy and we do research for other stakeholders who are interested in the Africa-China space. It was good listening to the statistics, Professor Logan. Let me say that sincere gratitude to the African Studies Center and the Congo Mano Group for putting together this event. As an alum, it's always refreshing to participate in an MSU event. In this presentation, I'm making a case for African agency and Africa-China relations. As some may have already gathered, the fact that one has to make a case for African agency in its interactions with partners is problematic at its core. Unfortunately, this topic has increasingly gained traction, and so permit a young African scholar to try to address some aspects of this issue. To do this, I'll be sharing some definitions of agency and African agency, lay the foundation for why this topic has become necessary to address, provide evidence to support African agency, in its relations with China, and then make a case for assessment, evaluation, and advocacy for more African agency in its partnership, not just with China, but with the rest of the world, to help the continent achieve its 50 years development plan and to reinforce Africa's position as a valuable global player. Now, agency in this context is defined as a sense of control to be able to influence things and faith in one's ability to handle a wide range of situations. It is one's independent capability to act or choose what action to take. Timothy Shaw defines African agency as the ways in which Africa's political, economic, social, and security actors can and do exert influence both on the continent and in global politics, as opposed to being passive targets or victims of others' actions. Based on these definitions, the question then is, why are we questioning Africa's ability or capacity to exert influence in continental and global politics? First of all, and as noted by one of the presenters in the just ended Global Solutions Summit held in Berlin, which I was fortunate to attend, in global problem sharing and solving, Africa has generally been treated as a problem that needs to be addressed, rather than a global player who can contribute to solving global problems. This disposition has meant that Africa has been refused a seat at the table, even after numerous calls and actions by Africans to correct this phenomenon. And when granted a seat, Africa's voice appears to be silenced. During the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, which was convened to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa, the only stakeholder obviously from the table was Africa. This colonial history, I believe, has shaped the West engagements with Africa. For example, it is difficult to explain why calls for the African Union to be invited to the G20 as a member, like the European Union, have gone unheeded, especially when scholars like Hannah Ryder and Jeffrey Sachs have made convincing arguments for how this would help in global problem solving. Africa has also relentlessly expressed its displeasure in not having a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. And the list goes on and on. Just to be clear, Africa has not asked to be handed everything on a silver platter. And as Robert Mugabe noted in his last United Nations address, and I quote, "We are fighters and will continue to fight for our place as Africans." This is to suggest that Africa didn't have a place in the UN or any other international architecture that is supposed to have the League of Nations. The continent is still employing both diplomatic and strategic approaches to finding its way into the Council as a permanent member. In addition, the Western media's coverage of the continent in global politics and issues have been heavily criticized by African scholars as perpetuating this narrative of a passive continent waiting to be saved, even against glaring evidence. A recent opinion piece, which is titled "What the Russia-Ukraine War and COVID-19 Reveal About Africa's Place in the World" by Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, puts this argument into serious perspective. Now, China, on the other hand, started its recent history with African nations as a partner with shared colonial histories and comrades against colonization. Africa and China did not begin their relations on the basis of superiors and subjects, or masters and slaves. China is not new to Africa. There is a shared history which can be traced to the 7th century, way before Vasco da Gama began trading in East Africa. Africa-China engagement, whether during the Ming Dynasty or China's arrival on the Kenyan coast in the 1900s, has mainly been economic in nature. Africa and China have enjoyed close to 66 years of contemporary diplomatic relations. Africa, like any other partner, flourishes and enjoys a relationship where it is heard and is able to contribute as a co-equal. Undeniably, Africa-China cooperation will be mutually beneficial and globally impactful when both parties exert themselves to the best of their abilities, taking advantage of their human, natural, and intellectual resources and capabilities. The Forum for Africa-China Cooperation, FOCAC, for example, was birthed as a result of African agency. African leaders, according to the FOCAC platform, proposed the need for a forum for Africa-China cooperation. And since its inception, African voices and views have been heavily reflected in FOCAC. Africa-China experts described the 2021 forum as the most Africa-led forum, suggesting that Africa's voice and influence in FOCAC is increasing and not diminishing. In addition, the forum captured massive African priorities, like the manufacturing of local vaccines, an aspiration partners in the West have failed to fully support. President Ramaphosa of South Africa bemoaned the West's refusal to assist Africa to produce the content of the coronavirus vaccines, and opposed the proposition to have Africa handle just the packaging and distribution of vaccines. China has shown great commitment to supporting Africa in achieving their shared interests, especially in this regard. African leaders have since 2000 preferred FOCAC to UN summits, as more African leaders attend FOCAC than any other international summit or meeting. At the AU's 35th ordinary session earlier this year, the African Union Commission chairperson called for a revisiting of the Union's approach to its foreign partnerships. Unsurprisingly, the new proposals were mainly focused on the FOCAC model. It is not surprising, therefore, that after the inception of FOCAC, China has surpassed the United States as the continent's largest trading partner. Now, in addition to all these, Africa, through FOCAC, has, one, increased its support for the frameworks of Agenda 2063. Now, for our audience who may not be familiar with Agenda 2063, Agenda 2063 is the African Union's 50-year development plan, which stipulates where Africa wants to be in the next 50 years. And this was started in 2013. And so from 2013 to 2063, that's our 50-year development plan as a continent. Secondly, Africa has increased reference to new Africa through FOCAC, has increased reference to newer and existing African-led institutions. Three, increased support for strategic African infrastructure development through the Program for Infrastructure Development, PIDA, and ODA NEPAD initiative. Now again, this is China and Africa leveraging African institutions and African initiatives to get things done. Four, increased support for innovative and flexible financing. Now, a very typical example of this innovative and flexible financing we see with the Ghana and the Sino-Hydro deal, where Ghana is exchanging infrastructure projects from China for bauxite. Five, move significantly away from the aid narrative to development financing, trade, and investment. Six, created an alternative to traditional global political systems and institutions that disadvantage the continent. The language of friendship, equality, and win-win partnership has become pivotal in Africa-China ties. Seven, created a table for itself and is inviting willing partners to come around. Now, whether or not this table, the partnership between Africa and China has created, is being maximized, is what the Afro-Sino Center and other Pan-African think tanks and research centers focused on Africa-China can assess. Looking forward, Africa and China have pledged to implement the following 9 programs. 1, a medical and health program, which includes supply of vaccines, construction of health and medical facilities, and medical personnel capacity building. 2, poverty reduction and agricultural development program. 3, trade promotion with emphasis on trade finance and export of African agricultural produce. Now, China plans to leverage the African continental free trade area in this regard. Interestingly, and just this week, South Africa started sending its first export of citrus to China, and Zimbabwe is also preparing to do so in the coming weeks or months. 4, investment promotion programs, which is expected to inject some $10 billion into Africa. 5, digital innovation program, including online shopping festivals and expansion of the Silk Road e-commerce. 6, green development program, which includes environmental protection and climate action projects. 7, capacity building program, which would include the building or upgrading of some 10 schools, urban workshops, and invitation of 10,000 high-level professionals to seminars and workshops in China and on the continent. 8, cultural and people-to-people exchange programs, including film festivals. And now we're excited as a Senate to say that with regards to this particular project, we have sent proposals and concept notes to our Chinese and African counterparts to see how we can link the Chinese movie industry to the African film industry using FESPACO, which is one of the biggest film festivals in West Africa. And 9, and the final one of the 9 programs that China and Africa seek to implement and for the next 3 years, Peace and Security Program, which includes military assistance. African think tanks and scholars, as well as the African people, have played a vital role and are increasingly involved in the China-Africa project. Last year, the African Union Development Agency, New Partnership for African Development, that's older NAPAD, in collaboration with ASCIR and the BRICS Research Center, held a symposium which brought together scholars and thinkers in the Africa-China space to deliberate on mechanisms to ensure that the continent benefits from its ties with China, and also to hold the two partners accountable. ASCIR's assessment report is meant to augment these efforts. There is still need for increased participation of Africans in shaping Afro-Sino relations. Of course, Professor Logan's illustration shows that there's still some lack of information and knowledge on Africa-China relations, especially when it comes to the average citizen on the continent. African scholars and thinkers must continuously work to brainstorm, critically analyze, assess, and monitor Africa-China engagements to help ensure that the continent is on track to achieving its development agenda, which at its core seeks to make Africa a valuable contributor to the globe. Now, in summary, this presentation has sought to throw light on the narrative that has presented Africa as a passive or not so active actor in its affairs, a narrative that has promulgated skepticism in Africa's dealings, especially with China. I've also tried to give a brief historical context to why this narrative is prominent among Western actors. I have argued that Africa's agency in its dealings, whether with the West or China, cannot be undermined, and that Africa continues to exert influence in its partnerships. And we are seeing this clearer now because a more friendly and mutually beneficial environment has been created. Finally, I have insisted that continuously monitoring, evaluating, and advocating for more advocacy, for more agency on the part of African actors is crucial in securing a mutually beneficial partnership between Africa and China. In concluding my presentation, let me say that the Afro-Sino Center of International Relations have been impressed by the incredible network of Africa-China experts and scholars who work tirelessly to give voice to Africa in an independent and dispassionate manner to ensure that a mutually beneficial partnership is achieved. Breaking through years of entrenched narratives that have generally silenced or tried to silence the voices of Africans, whether it's its leaders, people, and scholars, is not an easy task. But it is my fervent hope that as we all continue to discharge our duties, questioning long-held beliefs and systems, we will be able to encourage an inclusive global development program that recognizes the strengths and the weaknesses of all actors and use them for the collective advancement of our world. Thank you all so much for your attention. Thank you, Dr. Choti.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Arhin, for that very wonderful presentation as well. It's eye-opening for sure, because as I said in the beginning, these debates can only be well understood or can be given a basis if we have research going on or we have studies that will genuinely be able to bring perspectives either from scholars or from the civil society. So both of your presentations are really very helpful in helping us understand better what's happening really in the continent in terms of the relationship or the collaboration between China and Africa. So at this time, we're moving on to the discussion part question. I don't think we have any questions on the chat, which is fine, totally fine, because we have enough time to have a verbal discussion. If you feel free still, you can type your question, but it's open. You can unmute yourself if you have a question for either of the presenters and ask your question. I will start with the very brief questions. I'll start with Dr. Logan. So simply, how do you identify your respondents? I know it's the civil community that you target in your surveys. How do you identify who is going to participate in these surveys?
Okay, yeah, it's a really important question, because the whole purpose of Afrobarometer is to do nationally representative samples, which means that our findings should represent the findings of the society as a whole, so that we can say, you know, in Kenya, we did a survey with 1,200 or 1,600 people, and the findings here represent the findings of all, the views of all Kenyans. And the way you do that with the, excuse me, is to have a nationally representative sample. And that means we have to sample, we have to take, those 1,200 people have to be sampled randomly from all around the country. If I just went to urban areas, you know, or easier to reach places, I would get a much narrower sample, and their views wouldn't represent the views of the whole country. But if we do the sampling properly, the sample will represent the views of everybody. So just to give a really fast rundown on our sampling methodology, the key points are that it has to be random at every stage, so that everybody has an equal chance in the whole country of being selected. And we distribute the sample in proportion to the population. So if one region has 20% of the population, then 20% of our respondents should be selected in that area. Once we've allocated the sample around the country that way, based on the census from the government of where the population is located, we get what's called a census frame from the government, and it has lists of hundreds, actually thousands of enumeration areas, and that's each counting area for the census. Each one has about 150, usually 100 to 200 households. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but it's a long list. And we might say, okay, in this region, region X over here, we need to have 60 interviews done in that area. We'll go to that sampling frame and we'll pick randomly. We use a random number generator and randomly pick enumeration areas from that area. So there's no pre-selection, or there's no purposeful selection. It's all randomly selected. Then once we know that community that we're going to go to, we get a map of the community, and we draw random numbers to find a start point on that map, and we'll take the team to that spot. And then they'll start counting households and going in different directions to select different households to go to. Once they get to a household, we'll list the adults in that household, and then they'll randomly select one of those people. So it might be the mother, it might be the daughter, or the grandmother, or the father. It can be any, well, we do divide households between, we alternate households between men and women, but so that our samples are 50-50 men and women. But the whole idea is that basically you're trying to draw your 1,200 respondents from all around the country with equal chance that anybody in the country could be picked. And based on, you know, the development of survey research methodology, that's adequate to give us a sample that closely represents the findings of the country as a whole. So it's sort of a lot, it's a question that comes up a lot in our presentations when we're doing presentations in country. How can you talk to only 1,200 people and still know the views of the whole country, or talk to, in this case, you know, 45,000 people and know the views of people in 34 countries? But There's a lot of principles and research of survey methodology that have gone into that. And the idea is basically that if you stir your pot well and you don't have to eat the whole bowl of soup to know how salty the soup is, you can just take a spoonful, and that's kind of how we do it. It's got to be random at every stage so that people are selected without any purpose or preconceived criteria. So I hope that was a long answer, but that's sampling methodology in a nutshell. So
yeah, that really helps, because when you were talking, I was just wondering the same that you said other people have been asking. It's really hard to figure out how you can be able to sample from the different regions, but it does make sense in the procedure that you're following. Thank you so much.
I'll just say, if we do it right, and we check this afterwards. So when we have a sampling frame, all it tells us is where people live in urban or rural. It doesn't tell us ethnicity or age or education. But if it's done well and works well, what we should see is in that group of people that we actually selected, that their profile, the ethnic distribution, the age distribution, the education distribution should match what other, what we know about the population as a whole. And so we do that, we'll check afterwards and make sure, and you can get quite good match. So even though it's very random and not purposeful, if you do that random sampling right, the population of our sample should look like a snapshot of the population of the country as a whole.
Yeah, and it does feel like you must be having a lot of assistance in the different countries to be able to do that.
Yeah, we have national partners in every country where we work, so that are in the lead, and we work with them closely, but they run the field work in each of the countries where we work. So they know the places well, and they have access to get the sample frames and that kind of thing.
Thank you so much. One question, I know I'm holding up the audience, just one for Arhin. So Arhin, we know that there's usually disconnect between research and practice. For example, I do my research here, ASCIR does research, and it's supposed to be implemented, or the information that you gather around the relationship between China and Africa is essential. But how is the research, or how is the information that you gather connected to the implementers? That would be the government. For example, we are talking about agency here, and I probably think, or I believe that the government should take the lead in promoting the agency of the African nations. So how is the information you have correlate with what the government thinks or does?
That's a great question, Doc. That's a great question, and that's what we do as a center. As when we started with this center, that was one of the main things we looked at. Now, what the center has decided to do is that we are not only bridging the gap between academics and scholars and our policymakers, which in this case would be the government and the diplomats that we work with, but also with the population. So, for example, whenever ASCIR is about to conduct research, any research, as a center, we start with a webinar or a forum to discuss. We invite we invite as many stakeholders as we can, civil society organizations, the general public, and then our key stakeholders. We invite them into a room, either hybrid or online. We discuss the issues that we are trying to explore in our research. Based on that, we come up with what we call a white paper, which sort of gives our research a direction. As a center, we do not want to start a research and now come and give that research to the people and say, this is what we have done. But we start with the people to discuss, and then we get ideas, and then, people contribute, and then we get stakeholders telling us, okay, have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? Based on that, we now go out, do our research, and then bring our research back to our stakeholders. Every research ASCIR does, aside the voluminous research, and of course, very boring to read, as you know, as a researcher, we try to put all our research work. We also try to convert that research into readable bits or pieces. So when you go on our website, you see very short pieces, easy to read pieces, which sort of summarizes research that we have done, which the ordinary citizen wouldn't go to take and then to read. But going to answer your question directly, with regards to how our work gets to policymakers, our main stakeholders, like I said, are the African Union, which involves member states and the diplomats and leaders who work with the African Union, and the Chinese government. So most of our work, we're happy to announce that ASCIR has actually been recognized by the African Union as one of the key think tanks, which is going to focus on their China-Africa research. So any China-Africa research or project that the African Union has to undertake, they invite us, or we are part of that team to help them in regards to that. Also, our Chinese counterparts in Ghana, for example, we have that partnership. We have that communication, that engagement with them. So our work is shared. In my presentation, I made mention of the FESPACO film festival, which we are trying to sort of link between Africa and China. This information has been shared with our African Union counterparts, as well as our Chinese friends that we work with here and in other parts of the continent. So yes, we do share this with them, work with them, because they are major stakeholders.
Thank you so much for that response, Arhin, because it's important to be sure that there is correlation for sure, because there's no point of you doing this here and the other NGOs or other public entities are doing their, so collaboration basically is what I was achieving.
So, even if I may add just one bit to it, the African Union and China have been very particular and are very much interested in involving our scholars and think tanks. And we saw for the first time that in this FOCAC report that came up, there was a chunk of time and emphasis on actually including African think tanks, African and Chinese think tanks and research scholars in doing this work. Like I said in my presentation, China has now committed to taking 10,000 professional scholars and thinkers within the China-Africa space for capacity building and for training. So we are seeing an active recognition of CSOs and scholars or think tanks in this work. And like I said, African voices have been very reflective in the FOCAC. And we are seeing that most of the things, there were a ton of, prior to the FOCAC that was held in Dakar last year, there was a lot of focus groups amongst Africa-China scholars, the network. And most of the things we discussed and we talked about were actually captured in the FOCAC. And that is why in my presentation, I alluded to the fact that African voices have become very reflective in FOCAC. So we're seeing that, and we're seeing African and Chinese agency in this regard that is supporting the work of academics and scholars in helping shape Africa-China relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, for all the clarification and information, Arhin. So we have a question on the, and as I said, please feel free to raise a hand, unmute yourself, and engage our speakers. But I see one question in the chat from Haile Duguma, thanking you and then saying, since the foundation of AU, the leader from African countries always talk about how to maximize the position of the continent on the world. However, still no significant changes have been made. What might be the reasons? Do you feel the Africa-China relationship is mutual based and balanced for the benefits of both?
Is this question to me?
It does sound like it's to you, but if Dr. Logan has something, you can chime in as well.
I will defer to Arhin on this. I think this is his specialty.
All right, so yes, I agree with, is it Hailey? I agree with Hailey. One, we've seen some slow pace in terms of the AU, in terms of what Africans' expectations of the African Union. But just to give some foundation, the African Union, as we have it now, is not as old as we think. It was the OAU, which had a different mandate than the current AU that we have. I think the current AU we have is just, I think, 13 years or so. The OAU had a mandate to ensure that all African countries have gained independence. So the Organization of the African Union, the Organization of African Unity, it was called, was supposed to, or had a singular mandate, or a major mandate of ensuring the independence of all African countries. Now, it was able to achieve this, and now all 54, 55 African countries have gained their independence. So that mandate now moved to what we are now looking at, and which they would term as more economic integration, and that is what we see with regards to the African Continental Free Trade Area and that sort of thing. So yes, basically our Africans or observers will say that the OAU has been there since this time and we are not seeing much of it and all of that stuff. That is true. But again, the mandate has changed, and what it's supposed to be doing now has changed. We are seeing, if you've monitored the Africa relations space, African international relations space, you will find that until recently, the narrative has moved from aid to now development financing, investment. Initially, it was aid, and for a very long time, and until Africa insisted, Africans were not getting a lot of support for massive infrastructure development. And when I say massive infrastructure development, I'm talking about continent-wide infrastructure development, like the Tazara Railway that we see between Tanzania and all the way Zambia-Tanzania Railway, which Professor Manson has worked significantly on. But now, and that is where again I will revert to FOCAC. With FOCAC, we are seeing in mass, I don't know if people have monitored, but we are seeing that fast speed train railways are being, constructed all over Africa. We've seen the one in Kenya, we've seen the one in Dakar, Senegal, and so we are now seeing massive infrastructure, continent-wide infrastructure projects. We are also seeing Africa actually taking advantage of the Belt and Road initiatives to sort of enhance its agenda, especially its Agenda 2063. Finally, just to answer that question, we are also seeing an increase, and I mentioned that in my presentation, an increased reflection of African Union frameworks within FOCAC. So now, and that is the question people are raising, and that is where I'm sure Professor Logan talked about the debt trap narrative, where people are saying Africans are borrowing a lot. And now Africans are saying that, yes, we are borrowing a lot, but now we are borrowing for infrastructure. We are not borrowing for consumption. And infrastructure, it's a lot of money. And so when people say that, and a lot of articles have been written with regards to Africans' perspectives on Chinese borrowing or Chinese lending and Africa's borrowing of Chinese funds, they aren't really skeptical about Chinese loans. They are actually very skeptical about their leaders' abilities to use the money for what it's supposed to be used for. So if you're not careful, you say that Africans are skeptical about Chinese loans. Not necessarily. They are actually skeptical about their own leaders to use the money for what it's supposed to be used for. And so now I'll say, yes, Haley, you make a good point. It's been slow, but now we are seeing some sort of improvement, some significant improvement in Africa-China relations. And even now, because of the introduction of China, we are seeing the European Union exert itself more on the continent. We are seeing that. And as a result, we are also seeing the US now trying to come in more and to do more. We saw the Build Back Better initiative that President Joe Biden brought. Thus, as part of it, had an African component, which was supposed to help Africa in this regard. So yes, we are seeing more cohesion. The African Continental Free Trade, for example, is supposed to be a 3 or 30 billion economic community. So we're hoping that with all these measures put in place, and also with you and I actively monitoring, assessing, and evaluating our leaders and China and their engagements, we may be able to see some significant changes in the near future. I hope I answered your question or tried.
Haile, do you have any more comments? Oh,
I'll just add a couple points on that. Just to, I mean, I think it's very interesting, Arhin's point about, you know, the sort of efforts to give Africa as a whole and African countries more agency, you know, with China in the discussions with China. I mean, it's very consistent with what we see in the data, you know, related to China, but also as some of the data I mentioned that isn't China specific, but globally, that there's, you know, that people are looking for less conditionality, more financial independence, and you know, willing to, you know, when I see, you know, you can ask questions of people about trade-offs, like, would you like us to invest more in health? And, you know, if you don't make any trade-off, of course, everybody will say yes. But if you say, are you willing to pay more taxes to see the government invest more in health? You're putting a real trade-off on the table. And when we ask about these loans and development assistance, should we, you know, should the country continue, you know, should our country rely more on loans and development assistance from external partners, or should we rely more on our own resources, even if it means raising taxes? And people, you know, not everybody's in consensus, but there's definitely a majority that says we want to, you know, we should be financially independent, and even if it means more taxes, which I think is a pretty significant finding. And it just, I think it meshes quite well with what Arhin's saying about, you know, wanting more control, more agency. You know, we need to control our own destiny. And I just think it's really interesting the way that the kind of coming from two very different directions about those questions, that we're seeing very similar findings in terms of people's desire to have that independence in the world and be, you know, the agents of their own change, as opposed to sort of this sense that, you know, too much is being done to African countries from outside. So it's an interesting, I think, a very nice convergence of sort of, you know, the direction that it suggests people's thinking is moving. So it's not just the leadership, the public wants the same things that Arhin's talking about, I think.
And also, just to add to what Professor Logan just said, we also see that the foreign actors, China in this case, is also trying to reinforce that by saying that, hey, by bringing loans and all of that stuff, I have a non-interference policy. I'm not going to interfere in domestic politics. I'm not going to interfere or actually sort of be more laissez-faire with regards to what you do with your funds. And that has been also heavily criticized on the other side, saying that that is actually leading or will lead to the debt trap, where if you're given the fund and then you are not really monitoring to make sure it is used for what it's supposed to be used for, then you allow African leaders or corrupt African leaders to misuse or abuse those funds, and you don't really care about what Africans do with this money. Some scholars, of course, minority, have also argued that this sort of push for more conditionality, especially when it comes to developing countries like Africa or regions like Africa, is to say, or to re-entrench or to sort of reinforce the narrative that Africans are not capable of managing their own internal affairs. And so when there's any funding coming in, they need to be someone standing, looking over to make sure that they use it for the right thing, as though if left on their own, Africans cannot manage their resources or cannot manage the loans or the facilities they go for to develop themselves. So there's a whole lot of argument around these, but again, it goes back to Professor Logan's point that yes, Africans are saying that now we want some sort of independence. We want to see some sort of agency. And like I said in my presentation, we are seeing very innovative ways of dealing with China, or even going for these facilities, like the Sino-Hydro deal, which Ghana went into, and other countries are actually replicating that model. And for the longest time, we hadn't seen anything like this. So we are seeing some sort of innovation and some sort of space to function and to work as co-equals or as partners in Africa-China relations. I don't follow much of Africa-US relations or Africa-EU, but again, in Africa-China, we are seeing more of these. And if you follow from 2000, you see some significant changes, especially just read through the FollowUp report, and then you see that the language is improving. You see that the input is becoming better, if you ask me, especially for Africa. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you. I see no more questions on the chat. Peter, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you back at some point again. So anybody in the audience that has a question, you're free to raise a hand, unmute yourself, and ask or comment. It's time for discussion.
Hi, Damaris.
Yes, Rachel, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Arhin and Caroline, for the information that you shared. I think my question will go to Caroline, and it's kind of linking comments that both presenters have made. I'll start off by reiterating what Arhin said, that for a lot of African citizens, the concern is not the amount of debt that their governments are taking out, but rather how the governments are going to use the money for the actual purpose that they're getting it for, right? And that makes me think, now question to Caroline, for the countries that you chose to do your research in, and maybe you're not yet at that stage of analysis, but do you see, or are you hoping to do some cross-referencing or cross-analysis to see for countries that have better governance or delivery, the differences in the perceptions of the people based off of that? Is that something that has been done? And I missed your part of the presentation, so you probably talked about that, but I'm just curious to see if that is something that's going to be done, or if you've actually started noticing those trends at all.
Right, right. Well, in terms of what we're going to do, I mean, one of the challenges for Afrobarometer is we have data across a ton of different sectors and a ton of different countries. So there's sort of more analysis to be done with the data than we can do internally. And I'm certainly not I'm not an expert on China. My specialization is public opinion data and democracy and governance. So I haven't done, I mean, and I'll also just point out, I mean, one of the things that's happening is that our data is in the public domain. So tons of other people are also doing analysis with the data. So there's probably people out there looking at it. I mean, I think it's certainly something, one of the things I mentioned during the presentation, I mean, first, I'm just going to say, I do think that, we see, and that this kind of, again, ties into other data that we have about the quality of governance and people's concern about corruption and about how effective and trustworthy their leaders are. I mean, I do think there is concern about the level of debt, but, and whether countries are managing it well. At the same time that there's this desire for more independence and more agency in decision making. So, people do express caution about the level of indebtedness of their countries. We have not asked specifically about, is debt for this purpose better than debt for other purposes? I think it's an interesting thing that we could conceivably take up. In terms of looking at attitudes around that, I mean, certainly one of the things you can do is tie the data we have about China to data sets that about the level of investment from China in different areas, or about other kinds of data around the quality of governance. Certainly looking at, I have not specifically looked at this. I think you could look at it, would be to say, take the attitudes around, China and the US and look at it compared to levels of democracy, levels of governance, the quality of governance and other, I mean, there's a lot of cross-tabulations you can do. I haven't done it with this data because I focus on other areas in my kind of more in-depth analysis, but I think those are, sort of keeping a constant list after every talk of new areas that we should be doing some analysis. And I've got more and more grad students coming in to work with us. So we'll put that on the list. But I can say, I think that's a useful idea and thought about how to approach it. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. There was a question before Rachel that said, Dr. Logan mentioned of the narrowing gap between US and China, as in terms of perspectives, I believe. What's her opinion? Or what's the reason for this, do you think?
Well, the place where I mentioned the narrowing gap was in terms of the preferred model of development. And to be honest, the narrowing is a very small narrowing. So it's not necessary, if I'm recalling exactly correctly, not outside the margin of error or barely outside. So it's not been a significant shift over time. And in fact, where you see the larger shifts over time is if you look at individual countries. And in those cases, some have narrowed and some have widened. You know, again, it's an area where I think to really get into the details on that, you'd want to probably bring in external data. I mean, one of the great things about Afrobarometer data now is that we've geocoded everything, or we got help geocoding our first 6 rounds from another project, and then since round 7, our data is geocoded. So for example, you could take a geocoded data set about investment in China's investment in infrastructure in any given country, or even in any given region, and compare it to how attitudes are changing in that region. I think that's going to be one area to take a closer look at. I think what people are seeing in terms of the quality of how well resources are being used, how the quality of the infrastructure that's being built, and whether infrastructure is lasting, and whether it's better quality than some of the infrastructure they've gotten in the past, some of those kinds of things. I think you'd want to ideally kind of match up Afrobarometer's data about what people are saying, or how attitudes are changing towards China and the US, and match it up alongside of those other issues, as well as what's happening sort of, you know, geopolitically at a national level in terms of relations between their own country and China, and their own country and the US, and whether there's sort of, you know, been significant developments in those relationships in that intervening period between our 2 data points. Again, not something I've had a chance personally to do, but I think some great ideas about additional work that could be done with this.
All right. The chat, no more questions. Any last questions, comments? It does look like we've exhausted the discussion, since I don't see any hands up. No more questions on the chat, but just wanting to be sure that we're not closing anyone out before we close the discussion. All right. It looks like we need to close it here, and I personally feel like it's been a very productive discussion and new insights into this discussion, this subject, because we had a similar African Tea Time last year, I believe it fall or spring, and we had totally different perspectives. So it does depend on the new information, or who is presenting, what kinds of new information do we have about basically Africa-China relations. So what I might think we're planning to do as an African Tea Time Planning Committee is to have these discussions annually, if possible. And this depends on what other people think, because then it keeps us updated. We get to know what's new, what's the progress from the discussions that we've had previously. And this will just help us, instead of asking too many questions around us, at least we have experts, I would say people that have either done research or have had some kind of engagement directly with the organizations or government or bodies that do this kind of work, to be able to interact with them. And so we have like some knowledge that we would say it's substantial, or it's beneficial in understanding where we are at in partnerships, international trade, and things like that. So I want to sincerely thank you so much, Dr. Logan and Arhin, for accepting to spare your time. Arhin, it's getting late, I think, in Ghana now. But thank you so much for having accepted to be part of this discussion at this time. And you are an old-timer in African Tea Time. You've been participating since you were a student, and we really can't take that for granted. We continue appreciating that. The next tea time, it will be our last one this semester, and it will be focusing on totally something different, and it's gender and sexuality in the African context. We have one of our alums, Naomi Kamita, for those who know her, will be presenting together with her colleague from where she works in an organization in Kenya. And I look forward to seeing you if you are able to, and I hope you will join us for that last piece of African Tea Time for this semester, as we look forward to open it up again for the fall. Other than that, I'm really thankful for the audience that has been with us, has stayed with us until the end. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks or in the future at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Damaris, for setting it up.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Doc, and to all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you
Bye.
so much.